part 2 of the Beatles Iceberg, baby. Buckle up, Buttercup, because we are gonna wrap this mother up. Detective. Did someone say the Beatles? Me having followed through on an update. Look at this character development. Speaking of character development, my Beatles fanfiction reading series is going to continue on my channel, so check that out. But today we are finally doing it, the last years of the Beatles Iceberg. Warning, this is significantly darker and significantly more inappropriate than the previous part, so viewer discretion is advised. So let's jump right into it with Year 4, baby! Uh-oh. Holy emotional whiplash, Batman. George Harrison was almost assassinated. On December 30th of 1999, George Harrison and his wife Olivia woke to the sound of breaking glass and a man breaking into their home. The attempted assassin, Michael Abram, had religious delusions that he was the Archangel Michael sent by God to kill George Harrison. Shortly before the attack, he had been released from a psychiatric hospital after he was violent with a nurse. He was later discharged from that very same hospital because they decided he was free of mental illness, which is insane and an oversight on their part, so I would consider them partially responsible, but I also suspect they did this to simply get this violent man out of their ward in particular. It is insane that this guy even managed to get into George's house, because after previous stalking incidents, and also after the murder of John Lennon, which of course made George fearful for his life, he constructed large walls around his home, had security detail, and people who worked at his house were like, this is Fort Knox, there's no way anyone's getting in here. He still managed to scale the walls and break into their home by breaking through a window. But George very bravely fought back. I actually saw an interview of George and he was like, I thought of how my son needs a father. So he really fought with all of his might and started wrestling the attacker to take away his 7-inch knife from him. George was stabbed over 40 times, including in the lung, which caused his lung to collapse. He very narrowly survived and ended up staying for 2 weeks in the hospital before being discharged, which that's kind of nuts for what he went through, so he's very strong. But his loved ones suspect that this stabbing was a reason why he wasn't able to fully recoup from his second bout of cancer. George had had a previous bout with cancer, which he was able to recover from, but his loved ones say that the devastating effect that the stabbing had on his body made him too weak to fight it again, which I'm not sure that's how that works, but they're valid. But yeah, no, if you needed another reason to think George Harrison is cool, definitely fighting a home intruder is one of them. Moving on to something lighter, 4 Sides of the Eternal Triangle and After Geography. Now these are references to proposed early ideas for names for the album that would eventually become Revolver. But this isn't it. I don't know why they only put 2. There's a couple. The proposed names included 4 Sides of the Eternal Triangle, which I think is cool and trippy and weird. I think it's a little too weird, especially that early in their career. After Geography, Magical Circles, my favorite, Beatles on Safari, and Pendulum, all of which are pretty goofy and not incredible and also kind of long, kind of try hard. Revolver is nice and clean, it's one word, and in Beatles fashion, it's a pun, but it doesn't matter that it's a pun. It's like the Beatles name, it's technically a pun, but no one cares because that doesn't matter because the name is so ubiquitous that they don't need to be clever. It really functions by itself as a title, but it not only references a handgun, a revolver, but it's also a play on the format of the vinyl record itself, which revolves as it plays. Yep, the Beatles, masters of humor. Moving from one unused album name to another, A Doll's House was the original title given to what would later become the White Album. It was named after the Ibsen play of the same name. This image here, which you will normally see in connection with A Doll's House, was not actually the album cover. The album cover was always going to be white in order to contrast from the previous Sgt. Pepper's cover, which was so busy. It was like, we're gonna make it flat. It's just gonna say our name on it. It was considered, but then they were like, the white, it's cool. And they were right. They were 100% right. The reason why they didn't use this name is because it was already taken by a band called Family. So they simply chose to call it The Beatles. So it was their self-titled album, but now it is largely popularly called The White Album. So this next one is about the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, and I'm realizing that last video, I forgot a crucial detail in the Paul is dead theory. So if you look here at the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, and if we look a little closer, do you see these wax figures that are standing behind the Beatles? See, one of them looks real sad, and it's Ringo, and they're comforting him. What is he looking down at? He is looking down at a patch of flowers that is shaped like a left-handed guitar. Paul McCartney is left-handed. So generally, one of the pieces of evidence is this is Ringo looking down at Paul's grave, which is right there on the cover. Like, I don't believe it, but I'm like, why would you make a wax figure if that doesn't make any sense? Anyway, this album cover, of course, is one of the most famous of all time. So much so that the same photographer and the same style was used and ripped off by the Rolling Stones for their very mediocre album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. See, when you do satanic stuff, things don't come out well. As you can see, there are many life-size cutouts of figures such as Marilyn Monroe, Edgar Allan Poe, among others. Now, John Lennon was feeling like an edgy edgelord. He proposed a couple figures who did not make the cut. John Lennon originally wanted to put Hitler and Jesus, which I don't even like saying in the same sentence, on the Sgt. Pepper's album cover. But both of these purported figures were controversial in their own way. Hitler, because of Hitler, and in regard to Jesus, they were like, hey, don't put Jesus, people are gonna get mad because you said some pretty not nice stuff about Jesus just a couple months ago. But fun fact, a Jesus cutout never made it to the photo shoot, but a Hitler cutout did make it to the photo shoot. But it was hidden in the back while they were taking the picture. They're like, no. They're like, we can't get rid of this thing, but we're just gonna hide it behind everything else so no one knows it's there. But from certain different angles of the photo shoot, which by the way are just really cool to look at in general, you can see it, which is troubling. The Penny Lane vandalization. So obviously in Liverpool on Penny Lane, there was a sign to commemorate the fact that it's like, it's the thing from the song, you guys. Like, there's a lot of Beatles tourism, and that's an included part. And this commemorative sign itself was actually vandalized. And this was due to the allegation that the street itself was named after James Penny, who was a slave owner and trader. Now, this can be contested because it's like penny is also a word, so that could be used. It doesn't necessarily need to be named after him. However, Liverpool was an epicenter for the slave trade. There is debate whether it should be kept up to preserve both Beatles and national history, or whether it should be changed to avoid glorifying a slave owner. Don't know why all these album names are super far down, but Everest is another one. So Abbey Road was originally going to be called Everest. The only problem was that if they called it Everest, the Beatles would want to do, obviously, a photo shoot on Mount Everest. But that's a big ask, and they just ended up not being able to do it. So they ended up naming their album after the shooting location they did end up going with, which was obviously Abbey Road, which was outside of their studio. It was very impromptu. They just like walk across the street, they're like, this is gonna look sick. And then they ended up making like the most iconic album cover of all time, somehow. I like to think that they would have named their album after Anywhere. They took the picture, it's like somehow we'd end up with a Beatles album called Paul's Living Room. Paul McCartney, Michael Jackson. Maybe seems unlikely. I'd argue not. They were both the biggest pop stars of their time, and their friendship was extremely profitable in the 80s. They made the very cheesy "The Girl Is Mine" and "Say, Say, Say." Paul used his experience, wisdom, everything he learned, both what to do and what not to do from his career in the Beatles, to advise Michael, both in his career, in his investments, in his record contracts. Much like the Beatles, where they had a previously very friendly manager, very personable manager, and then later had one who had more business interests, Michael was definitely surrounded by people who wanted to exploit him left and right. So having a friend like Paul McCartney, who is experienced and also was looking out for him, invaluable. Very important. This was until Michael Jackson bought the Beatles' entire discography, which included some of Paul McCartney's music, and this created a rift, and their public relationship at the very least was severed. Don't Pass Me By was written in 1962. Pretty explanatory, not gonna lie. Don't Pass Me By was indeed written in 1962 by Ringo Starr. He said he wrote it when he was just banging away at the keyboard. In true Ringo fashion, it was put up right on the refrigerator and stayed there until 1968. Thankfully, it was released for us all to love. I always love a Ringo song. Stream Goodnight, everybody. That's a great song also. Also, Boys. Boys is one of my favorite Beatles songs. It's classic rockabilly, it's classic skiffle, and it's just Ringo going off and singing really well because he has a nice voice. He has a nice voice just for Ringo. Justice for Ringo. The Beatles insulted Imelda Marcos, so this is a little misleading. Hey, Iceberg, you're spreading the same misinformation the Beatles were actively combating at the time of this controversy. Oh, not a good look. In 1966, the Beatles went to the Philippines, where they performed 2 big concerts. The Beatles were then subsequently invited to the presidential palace to visit the Philippines president, as well as his wife, Imelda Marcos. Brian Epstein declined their offer because he just had a general policy. It's like the Beatles aren't going to be accepting any formal invitations. This was just a catch-all policy. So they left Imelda, as well as 300 children of high-ranking officials who she had invited as guests, waiting. Never came. The press was going really hard on the Beatles, saying that they purposefully slighted and snubbed their first lady. So a lot of people got really mad at the Beatles. Brian Epstein literally had to go on TV to make a statement to clarify what happened. But, and I can't even make this up, the broadcast of his public clarification was interrupted by TV static. So everyone was just more confused and it just got worse. While they were leaving, it was a mess at the airports, and Mal Evans, their road manager, was beaten up by an angry mob. And guess what? After this huge controversy, the next month, the Bigger Than Jesus thing happened. Oh my gosh. This is a political cartoon that someone made about it. Tier 5, tier 5, tier 5, tier 5. Tier 5. On George cameo in a movie, yay! George was a huge Monty Python fan and later became friends with Monty Python, essentially frontman, Eric Idle. During his sort of film producing era, that was something he was into for a little bit. George funded the film Life of Brian by mortgaging his house. And I think he knew he wasn't the greatest actor in the whole wide world, but he still wanted to be in the film, and so he ended up being a background extra. It's fascinating because going into this, you would never think George has all the deep lore, but you'd be so wrong. George's birthday, the most controversial of Beatles' birthdays. For most of George's life, he believed that his birthday was February 25th, and all was well. But later in his life, it was discovered that his birth certificate and hospital records said 2 different dates. There had been an error, and George's birthday was actually on February 24th. So actually, psych April Fools, George made all of that up. He wasn't even born in a hospital. He was born in his house. He was indeed born on the 25th, and he just felt like messing with everybody because people call him the Quiet Beatle, but George was a trickster, a deviant, and he wasn't. But I'd argue George was actually the funniest Beatle. So after hearing all of this about John Lennon, you might be shocked that he was a scout and a choir boy growing up. Although he's broadly known as the troublemaker, which continued from his youth into his career onward, you know, especially him making songs like How Do You Sleep about Paul, like that feud was crazy. He grew up as a member of St. Peter's Church Choir and was a member of the Ullerton Scout Troop, which is alleged by the scouting organization to be where John and Paul met. But that's them saying that, so I don't really buy it. SNL offered the Beatles $3,000 of obviously that time's money to reunite and play on SNL. On air, during the show, Lorne Michaels, mostly joking, offered the Beatles $3,000 to reunite and play on SNL. Funny thing is, John and Paul were at John's apartment and were watching SNL together at the time and briefly genuinely considered it. Paul said the reason that he refused was because he was tired. But George was later a musical guest on SNL, and Paul McCartney very recently played at SNL 50 playing a really amazing medley. It was like so beautiful. Tier 6, tier 6, tier 6, tier 6. It's tier 6, my pretties. Ringo's childhood. All the Beatles had a tough childhood in one way or another. John Lennon's mom died, Paul McCartney's mom died. Lots of things were going on, but Ringo had a particularly uniquely troubled upbringing. He was poor. His parents got divorced when he was young, and he had multiple diseases growing up, including tuberculosis and appendicitis, and this led to him being somewhat of a hypochondriac later in life and not always being keen on shaking hands because he is more susceptible to getting sick and would get sick during the Beatles' career. Due to all of his time spent in the hospital, he missed a lot of school, and he was illiterate even up until the age of 8. And in the hospital, Ringo would be introduced to percussion instruments, which was one of the only things he had to do to pass the time. This is how Ringo fell in love with percussion and ended up being the best, hottest, most in-demand drummer in Liverpool. John Lennon almost killed a man. Bob Wooler was a well-known manager in Liverpool during the time of the Beatles. He was also a resident DJ at the Top 10 Club in Liverpool, but Bob finally met the Beatles as the owner of the Cavern Club, where the Beatles would famously get their start. At Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party, John Lennon was asked by Bob Wooler how he enjoyed his honeymoon with Brian Epstein, which is a reference to the 1963 vacation that John Lennon and Brian Epstein took privately in Barcelona, which has been a point of speculation, but I think that's unfair. I think that's none of our business. Let's not be weird. Furious at the implication of being seen as gay, John began to brutally beat up Bob Wooler, leaving him unconscious, bloody, and bruised. John recalls stopping and thinking to himself that if he continued beating this man, he could kill him. So it's not he was going to kill somebody, but he realized that he had that capability. After a while and settling down, he was able to send a telegram to Bob Willer saying he was sorry. This was a big wake-up call for John Lennon, where he suddenly became aware of what his anger could do and what he's truly capable of. According to his wife Cynthia, he vowed that he would never do such a thing again. And according to Cynthia, he didn't. Whether that means being violent in general or almost killing somebody is up to speculation. It was a pretty vague statement. Paul McCartney witnessed 9/11, and he also did so in a very unique way. Paul McCartney was in a grounded plane at the JFK airport awaiting the takeoff when he witnessed the 9/11 attacks out of his window. Of course, as a result of this, he was stuck in the plane for a long time and stranded in New York City, I'm sure even longer. But he made it out safe and sound. But obviously, very mentally impacted. Moved by this experience and also harnessing the influence he has as Paul McCartney, one of the Beatles, he helped to organize the Concert for New York City, which was a benefit concert that happened in the wake of 9/11. Paul also later wrote the song Freedom about the tragedy. Another fun John fact, John liked to sleep in a coffin. Okay, Goth GF. Okay, Ebony Darkness Dementio Ravenway. Be careful, we gotta baby-proof that edge. You might get hurt. In 1957, John Lennon enrolled in art school. And while there was a coffee bar that he was known to frequent that was run by Alan Williams, who was his manager at the time. In that coffee bar, for some dang reason, was an old abandoned coffin in which John Lennon liked taking naps for some reason. So it wasn't like he was sleeping in it, it wasn't like it was in his house, but like, that's so eerie. Final tear. We did it. I'm gonna miss you guys. Final tear. But it's not the final tear in my eye. I love whoever made this iceberg, but what a nothing burger to put in the last tier. In 1972 and 1973, Pink Floyd used Abbey Road Studios to record their debut album, primarily utilizing Studios 2 and 3. All of the editing equipment at the Beatles' disposal during their extremely experimental years was at theirs. They used much of the editing equipment in Room 4 in order to create the cross-fading effects that are seen on Us and Them and Money. Another very sad entry, John Lennon's last photo. The last known photo of John Lennon, taken on the day of his assassination on December 8th of 1980, is famous not only because it's the last, but because of a horrifying detail. If you look in the background of the image, you can see John Lennon's assassin, Mark David Chapman. Not only was he there, but he got his copy of Double Fantasy signed by the man who he would later murder on the front steps of his apartment building that day. Truly terrifying. I wanted to make sure this last entry was juicy, so we're talking about Jimmy Nicol, everybody. Who's Jimmy Nicol? Great question. Jimmy Nicol was a Beatle for a week. At the very height of their popularity, Jimmy Nicol sat in for Ringo as the Beatles drummer for 8 concerts because Ringo Starr was out with tonsillitis. Despite him briefly being in the most famous band in the whole world for a time, he fell immediately into obscurity after the fact, as soon as Ringo came back. Unlike someone like Pete Best, who tried to stay relevant through their connection with the Beatles, Jimmy did quite the opposite. He laid low. He moved to Mexico. He played with other bands and then turned to entrepreneurship. Most of the Beatles accepted him as a temporary replacement, but George, being a real one, threatened to not go on tour at all. Being like, if you can replace Ringo, then you can replace me. George was mad that they would replace Ringo for any period of time as opposed to simply canceling the dates. Ringo Starr is quoted as saying, "It was very strange them going off without me. They'd taken Jimmy Nicol and I thought they didn't love me anymore. All that stuff went through my head." That's so sad. That's so sad. He took it so personally. But Jimmy played with the band anyway, the rest of the band intact. He was given a mop top for these 8 nights to match everyone else and actually wore Ringo's suit, which is like pathological. Like that, I'd be upset about that too. Nicol is quoted as saying, "The day before I was a Beatle, girls weren't interested in me at all. The day after, with the suit and the Beatle cut, riding in the back of the limo with John and Paul, they were dying to get a touch of me. It was very strange and quite scary." Nicol also details a time that him and John Lennon went to a brothel together. Generally, Nicol was a very good source to talk about the Beatles' truly debaucherous side. For his time, he was paid £500, which today comes out to $12,798. He got to be a Beatle for a while, but now is largely forgotten. So let's remember him. This is also good Beatles trivia to impress your friends. As Nicol said, "Until then, I was quite happy earning £30 or £40 a week. After the headlines died, I began dying too. After the money ran low, I thought of cashing in some way or another, but the time wasn't right. And I didn't want to step on the Beatles' toes. They had been damn good for me and to me. I like him. He has integrity. He's like the anti-Pete Best. I can't believe it's over. That was the Beatles Iceberg, everybody. All 7 tiers? That was so fun. Thank you for being so patient and waiting for my follow-up. I really hope you enjoyed it. I really hope you learned something new. I hope you were entertained. If you would like to suggest any other icebergs you'd like me to do, please comment them down below. I gladly will. I have loved this iceberg for years. And I want to thank you all so much for your support, your love, your comments, your likes, your views, and just for being here. It really means a lot to me. Comment down below if you have any other really obscure Beatles facts, because I always want to learn more. God bless and have an amazing day. I've been Ducky and you've been lovely. Goodbye.